You found the skeleton. How would you tell people that it's science? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today I'm going to take a look at a lecture given back in 2019 by Dr. John Sanford, who taught biology at the university level for some 18 years. Which means if he gets biology wrong, he doesn't have much of an excuse. Now, John Sanford is the guy who came up with the idea that resurrecting the long-debunked idea of error catastrophe and rebranding it as genetic entropy would somehow be a problem for science. I'm not going to get too far into that now, as he'll get into it later, but it should be noted that he's also Sal Cordova's boss, or partner, it's unclear to me. So Sal, when you watch this, sorry about being mean to Sanford, but he's going to say some very silly things. The title of this talk is What Darwin Got Wrong, and here's the thing about that. It's being used as a way to try to persuade his audience that science is wrong about biology. But here's the problem with that. It makes no more sense than it would to say that because Newton spent a bunch of time trying to transmute lead into gold, therefore modern physics is nonsense. See, the problem is no one cares what Newton said on the grounds that he's the one who said it. We only care in science to the extent that his statements conform to the evidence. And it's the same with Darwin. No one cares about what Darwin got wrong, we only care about what he got right because it conforms to reality. And if he had never said it, then we wouldn't care. So what I'm going to do is simply pretend that when Sanford complains about what Darwin said, that he's complaining about modern science, since that's what matters. And I will use modern science up until around the point of 2018, the year before this talk, to back up my corrections of Sanford. I'm only going up to 2018, since going much past that wouldn't be fair, as even if Dr. Sanford were careful to keep up with the literature, there'd be a fair chance that anything relevant that was that recent he might have missed simply by chance. Well, now that we have that long preamble out of the way, here we go. Time to hear from Sanford himself.
All right. Well, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share with you tonight.
You know what? Me too.
And it's a privilege for me to come alongside the people at Creation Ministries International.
Dr. Sanford is at this CMI event, but he doesn't actually work for them. He's mostly retired, and as far as I know, he was never actually employed by a creationist organization.
And this is an awesome ministry that they have, and I'm just glad to offer my small part. Today, I've been asked to talk about the subject of Darwin was wrong, and that is a big subject. In addition to being now a semi-retired professor at Cornell University, where I hold a courtesy position, I'm also president of Logos Research Associates, which is a group of scientists who are showing that good science affirms Scripture.
Well, yeah, as a rule, anyone who died 137 years before you talk about them was wrong about a fair bit of stuff. See, that's something I don't really have a problem with, as long as you're not starting with the conclusion. As I've said before, if you just happen to find that science confirms your reading of a sacred text, then that's cool. But if you start out with the conclusion that it does, and then you cram science into that ill-fitting box you've constructed for it, then you're not doing science. Anyone want to take bets as to which one the people at Logos Research Associates are doing?
And back in 2009, the year of Darwin, the year of the 150th celebration of his book, Origin of Species, Logos sponsored a Darwin Was Wrong conference at a mega church in California.
Yeah, that fact alone indicates to me that they're probably not doing science. If they were, they'd have a conference on, science, not a historical figure from 150 years ago, who obviously isn't really publishing in the field. We all know Darwin got many things wrong. It doesn't matter. In fact, I find it hard to see why you talk about it at a science conference dedicated to overthrowing the modern consensus, unless you had ulterior motives. At a history conference, that would make sense, although talking about what he got wrong would be an odd thing to focus on even there. But at least Darwin per se would make sense as a topic.
Through Calvary Chapel. And that involved 10 speakers who talked about their 10 different ways that Darwin was wrong, and it took, like 10 hours. And so today I'm going to give you a slightly shorter version of that. And I'd just like to ask you, why would it matter if Darwin was wrong?
Yeah, that is a great question.
I mean, everybody's wrong sometime. And if you look at any historical figure, you can find fault with things or things they didn't know.
That's true. It's kind of why we don't worship Darwin or venerate him as a saint.
But of course, the reason it's important is because this seemingly ordinary man, he's the only one, I believe, in human history who simultaneously impacted so powerfully, both scientifically and spiritually, the world. He changed the world in a profound way.
Yeah, kind of. The thing is, his ideas did, but those ideas don't depend on him. In fact, he wasn't the only one around at the time who had the same basic idea of variation in natural selection and later sexual selection. It's kind of like Newton and calculus. Calculus was also being worked out by others, and if Newton had keeled over dead of drinking mercury before he got Principia Mathematica finished, then at worst, calculus would have been delayed a few years. The same is the case with Darwin and the theory of evolution. If he had never written Origin of Species and his later works, then we might be a few decades behind on evolutionary biology, but that's it. And that's because Darwin isn't the prophet of science. No one is bowing down towards the Galapagos and saying there is no science but evolution and Darwin is its prophet. Modern papers don't normally reference Darwin unless they're mentioning a species he described, and then really only to credit him with the description.
And the consequences of his ideas have had profound social and moral consequences.
Did you know that bad consequences don't make a proposition false? That the consequences of your house being on fire are bad doesn't mean your house isn't on fire.
So really, the world we live in today has been shaped by these concepts that are attributed to him.
Right, in the same way that the world has been shaped by the concepts attributed to Pythagoras. Pythagoras was right about a bunch of things, but he also thought irrational numbers didn't exist to the point of maybe murdering someone for proving that they did, and he thought beans were evil. Yet I don't see creationists saying that because Pythagoras got things wrong that we should toss out trigonometry. Well, except maybe for some flat earthers. Then again, the only difference between believing in a flat earth and a young earth is how long we've known you're wrong.
And so, you see, if Darwin was wrong, it's a really, really big deal. It's an earth-changing deal.
No, it's really not. It's as big a deal as that Pythagoras was wrong. No one does trigonometry the way it's done now because of Pythagoras. They do it because there are mathematical proofs and it works in the real world. Similarly, no one believes in evolution because Darwin said it as if he's a prophet. People accept evolutionary theory because it fits the evidence and makes predictions, which can be and are confirmed, and just as importantly, can be and are not falsified.
And I believe he was wrong. I believe we can show that Darwin was profoundly wrong about all the key issues.
Well, let's keep in mind that since it doesn't matter, I'm going to be judging this on the basis of actual contemporary science, not science from more than a century and a half ago.
And that includes both the scientific issues and the spiritual issues.
Why? Who the heck is getting spiritual guidance from Darwin?
So let's go on and look at the different ways that Darwin was wrong. So Darwin was wrong about many things. I'm only going to cover what I consider the 7 most important mistakes that Darwin made. Darwin was obviously wrong about God.
Don't care.
Darwin was wrong about science in a fundamental way. Darwin was wrong about geology. Darwin was wrong about the fossil record. Darwin was wrong about the tree of life. Darwin was wrong about the nature of life. And Darwin was wrong about the thing that he's best known for, which is natural selection.
The thing he's best known for and was most right about. I look forward to Sanford's explanation of how it can be that an easily observed phenomenon just doesn't occur.
Now, most people in the university environment believe he was right on all 7 points.
I would be very curious to see a survey of modern scientists on whether they agree with Darwin on agnosticism and whatever the heck the nature of life is. I bet it's not going to be even close to universal assent like Sanford claims.
But I'm going to show you that he wasn't. So the first one is Darwin was wrong about God.
Well, I don't care about that, so unless some scientific claims are made about the natural world, I will skip.
So icon number 2, Darwin was wrong about science. So here we have the thinker with Darwin's face showing. And so the question was Darwin primarily a scientist or a philosopher?
In case you're wondering, I saved you from like 5 full minutes of whining about how skepticism was valued in the 19th century and how even Christians knew that the earth was old.
He's usually billed as one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. But if you read his work and the commentaries on his life, you will realize that he was, in fact, primarily a philosopher.
People can be more than one thing at a time.
So he was primarily a philosopher, as can be seen by the fact that he was utterly committed to philosophical naturalism.
But he wasn't. He was a believer until the death of one of his young children. He was committed to methodological naturalism in science, as all good scientists are. Methodological naturalism is the idea that science is the study of how the natural world operates, whether or not supernatural entities are real, nor are they to be used as explanatory mechanisms. And this is how science must proceed, because science is fundamentally about things that happen reliably. God, should he exist, by most accounts, is not so reliable that you could experiment on him. Further, if a miracle occurred, all science could do would be to fail to explain such an occurrence. It couldn't declare it a miracle, but similarly, it couldn't say it wasn't. The other option is to allow an untestable divine foot in the door, and that simply leads to stagnation. Why investigate storms when we all know it's just Thor fighting the Jotun? Why bother to figure out why volcanoes erupt when all we really need to do is toss enough fine liquor into them to propitiate Pele? Why investigate how biodiversity is generated or how organisms are related by descent when Jesus just made them more or less the way they are now? Methodological naturalism isn't philosophical naturalism, and scientists aren't required to be philosophical naturalists. Many scientists are explicit supernaturalists in their philosophy, but they also know why supernatural causation has no place in science, even if it's real.
That is, his work started and ended on the premise that he must build on the Enlightenment philosophy of naturalism or materialism.
In science, and he's right about that.
Furthermore, his only degree was in theology, and he didn't study theology because he was interested in God.
In fact, being a man who'd grown up Unitarian but was attending an Anglican seminary, he didn't study theology all that much at all. He was much more interested in horse riding, hunting, and taxidermy. The only reason he was there was that his father was upset that he'd abandoned his medical training, and there weren't many acceptable occupations for a wealthy Englishman. And medical doctor and clergyman were two of them.
But because it might put him in the right places at the right time for his career advancement.
Or so thought his father. Turns out, it really didn't, and Darwin got on in naturalist circles on the basis of his careful observation, specimen collection and preparation, and his keen theoretical mind. I'm not aware of any naturalists, which is what scientists were called at the time, asking for his opinion on the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Virgin Birth, or soteriology.
He was not an experimentalist.
Not all science takes place in a lab where experiments are done on the objects of study. Does Dr. Sanford have a view of science equivalent to that of a fourth grader? Let's go away from biology and look into other sciences in which experimentation is difficult or impossible. Chief among these is astronomy. You can't put stellar objects in a test tube and manipulate them. You have to just look into the sky and see what you see. You can take stellar spectra and break them down with laboratory equipment. You can make predictions about the orbits of stars, the formation of galaxies, the distribution of interstellar matter, etc. But you can't grab a galaxy and stir it about to see what happens. At best, you can simulate it, but that's hypothesis building, not really an experiment on the subject of study itself. Similarly, field biology, which is most of Darwin's primary research, is done by observing, collecting, and cataloging wildlife. Darwin didn't need to bring back a boat full of aviaries with live birds in order to do science both on his voyage and afterward. And also, he didn't need to be constantly gathering more specimens in order to hypothesize about the data he had already collected. It is unusual the degree to which his scientific career is split into a distinct and prolific data gathering phase, followed by a phase of intense theoretical work with little further data gathering. But that doesn't invalidate it, and even if it did, guess what? Modern science doesn't give two shits about what Darwin said, or that he said it. Really, I'm just pointing out that Sanford has what could charitably be termed a childlike and naive understanding of the basics of what science is, how it functions, and why it is the way that it is.
Now, he had an awesome adventure on the Beagle for 7 years. And he had some wonderful observations and experiences during that time in his life.
And he did a lot of science while he was doing it.
But from that time until he was an old man, he really didn't do any experimental science.
Not personally, but again, experiment isn't a necessary condition for science to be done. And further, he consulted with those who were conducting experiments in artificial selection. And I'll point out that artificial selection isn't exactly non-natural, since it's done by humans, not as far as we can tell by ghosts or gods or angels.
He, as an old man, he loved to do experiments with worms and ants. Why do you suppose he wanted to do that? Because he wanted to argue that human behavior can be traced back to just natural selection.
You mean as a young man, before he'd come up with the idea of natural selection, he was doing the experiments we were told he didn't do in order to demonstrate the idea that he hadn't? Sal, if you're watching this, what's up with your boy John here? Am I really supposed to take this man seriously?
And he assumed that worms and ants have no moral guidance.
Given that they barely have brains, that's not such an unusual conclusion to reach.
So, mostly he was an amateur scientist. He was pretty much sequestered in his living room all his life. He never had to earn a living. And so he just spent his whole life developing his evolutionary theory. He was truly a man possessed with that fixation.
More or less, yes. But here's where I have to break in to remind everyone that the point of this talk is not really to say how much Darwin sucked, because properly understood, whether he did or not doesn't matter. So are there modern experiments in evolution? Well, of course. Experiments are routinely done in organisms with short generation spans, since that's where evolution is easiest to observe. There are famous experiments, like the Luria-Delbruck experiment, that demonstrated not just natural selection, but that mutations, still not really understood at the time, were spontaneous and not in response to specific stimuli. There's the Zelensky long-term E. coli experiment that has not only demonstrated natural selection, but also shown why basically every creationist objection to it fails. It has shown that irreducible complexity isn't a barrier to evolution, shown that the waiting time problem isn't a problem, and demonstrated that genetic entropy simply isn't a thing that can be found in the real world outside of creationist computer programs, specifically designed to find it. But there are other experiments that are less famous, but still provide confirmation of evolutionary theory all the time. Biology students the world over raise fruit flies for experiments in genetics and natural selection, in some cases even managing to cause speciation events in captive populations. There are experiments on bacteria on large prepared surfaces being forced to adapt to ever-increasing amounts of toxins, where in the experiment itself you can trace the branching paths of bacterial evolution. There are fossil digs whose location is based on evolutionary biology to find predicted fossil organisms, making just the dig itself an experiment. No matter how much or how little experimentation Darwin did, lack of experimentation in evolutionary biology is not a thing.
And what he did as his line of argumentation was he relied heavily on extrapolation. Well, let's see, if we see a little selection going on in nature, then if we have enough time, eventually, who knows what it could accomplish. And in addition, he relied heavily on just-so stories. Does that sound like modern Darwinists today?
I don't know anyone today who describes themselves as a Darwinist, so I don't know. And no, this isn't just nitpicking. Call people what they call themselves where at all possible. No one is a Darwinist because no one is a follower of Darwin per se. Would young Earth creationists like it if I just called them baby Earth lunatics? Probably not, and I don't do it, because it's needlessly unhelpful. It's not how they identify, and it implies things about them that they would reject. Similarly, no one that I know of self-identifies as a Darwinist, and it implies a devotion to the ideas of Darwin that I have never known to exist anywhere.
It's really, nothing's changed. So, in science, a credible story is not a proof.
Well, you have an answer to, could this thing happen? If you want to know, how did this thing happen? Then you've got a lot more to do. But the thing is, what creationists like to do is pretend that the basic and readily observable phenomena in evolution are simply impossible. And all this needed to show that something isn't impossible is one possible way for it to occur. For example, if you tell me it's impossible to drive from Fairbanks, Alaska to Tampa, Florida, in response to someone claiming such a drive has happened, or is at least possible, then all I need to do is to show that there are in fact roads between those locations and show that at least one possible route exists. Now that doesn't mean that Joe over here, who claims to have driven between the two, had to take the route that I describe. Maybe he took one of the myriad other possible routes. But because at least one exists, the impossibility argument is defeated. Similarly, if a creationist says that an irreducibly complex structure can't evolve, all that needs to be done is to show that a single plausible pathway for any irreducibly complex structure to evolve exists, and that argument is finished.
But in evolutionary science, if you can tell a story and it sounds feasible, there you got an answer, because there's no way to test it.
Of course there are. That's just a lie. And yes, I'm calling Dr. John Sanford a liar. Because he worked for nearly 2 decades as professor of biology. I'll give an example. Some rodents and all monkeys have a broken gene that in other animals allows them to synthesize vitamin C. As a result, animals like guinea pigs, humans, and spider monkeys are all susceptible to scurvy. Also, there are a few possibilities. Maybe since rodents and primates are fairly closely related among the mammal orders, this is a shared trait, and some rodents simply re-evolved vitamin C synthesis. Alternatively, perhaps each species had an independent loss of vitamin C synthetic capacity. Last, perhaps the ancestor of monkeys lost this ability, and so did the ancestor of, say, caviomorphs, independently. Well, how could we test this? By looking at the genes for making vitamin C. If this ability was lost in a common ancestor of primates and rodents, then we should expect a particular mutation or set of mutations to the vitamin C gene shared across all those organisms, with varying repair mechanisms among animals like beavers, colugos, and lemurs, such that each rodent, scandensian, or primate with a functioning vitamin C gene should have significantly different ones, since they were independently derived and then presumably through different mutations repaired that function. If on the other hand this is broken independently in many lineages, then we should expect different causes for the gene's non-function in different lineages. So humans, capybaras, and baboons should all have different causes for the non-functionality of this gene. If instead this breakage happened only twice in a rodent, and then in an ancestral monkey, then we should expect that all monkey pseudogenes to make vitamin C should be broken in the same way, but that it should be a different way to the way that it is broken in rodents. Now, before we even go check, we can tell that the 2 breakages model is the most parsimonious, so it's probably the one we put our money on. As it turns out, this experiment was done, and the 2 breakages model was supported and the others disconfirmed. Right there is an observation that some glears cannot produce vitamin C, a hypothesis that there are 2 separate events causing the gulo gene to break and no longer function, and an experimental test, that is, sequencing the genomes of rodents and monkeys. Finally, we have a discarded alternate hypothesis, not just on the grounds that they seem more complex, but on the basis of actual evidence, some of which is experimental. That's exactly what Dr. Sanford pretends can't be done.
And so lastly, his theories lacked scientific rigor. He made arguments and defenses for his ideas, but they didn't follow scientific procedures. There's not a single equation in his book, there's no mathematics in his book, no numbers.
Boy, was I wrong.
No numbers, huh? Well, that's weird, because while I'll ignore dates and page numbers, there's an estimate that a monarch in India kept 20,000 pigeons. In the section of geometrical ratio and increase in population size, there's a discussion of elephant population growth over time that uses math. In the section complex relation of all animals and plants to each other in the struggle for existence, there's a discussion using math of the various reproductive capacities of Trifolium repens, the Dutch clover, and T. pratense, the red clover. In the section specific characters more variable than generic characters, we have a discussion of ratios of individuals in previous generations that count as ancestors. That requires math. In the section on the lapse of time, as inferred by the rate of deposition and the extent of denudation, Darwin uses a whole mess of math to come up with the estimated minima for the duration of deposition of various rock formations. So I have to wonder, why is Sanford saying that Darwin doesn't do any math in Origin of Species? It's demonstrably not true, and all you have to do is go find the online edition from Gutenberg.org and use Control F to search the document, then type literally any numeral. I used 0. So has Sanford not read the book, or even bothered to check his claims by the easiest imaginable option which would give good results? Does he just not care whether the things he says are true? Is he lying? I doubt I'll hear from Sanford himself, but hey, if Sal Cordova is watching, I encourage him to pass this question along to Dr. Sanford, because I would really like an explanation for Sanford just spouting obvious falsehoods about a book that, I'll remind people, is irrelevant to actual modern science.
And there's no logical proofs or formal logic in he just argues his point like a philosopher would.
Weird, because formal logic is actually the domain of philosophy and is far less important in science, because science is empirical, and interestingly, empiricism is more or less impossible to arrive at as reliable by formal logic. This is because consistent past experiences do not logically entail that future experiences will be the same. If every time you've ever seen a swan it was white, it doesn't demonstrate that the next time you see a swan it will be white. And for some people who saw the first black swan, that was dramatically demonstrated. So we shouldn't expect formal proofs in science. That's not what science does. It's what philosophy and mathematics do. I find it deeply ironic that Dr. Sanford is complaining that Darwin wasn't scientific enough and was too philosophical, because he did science and not philosophy. You know who is scientific enough, though? My subscribers. So why not go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already done so? It's free and you can undo it if you regret it. Also, remember to use the bell icon to turn on all notifications.
So let's just look a little more carefully at what the scientific process is.
Oh goody.
The scientific process begins with conception, which involves brainstorming and free speculation.
And here I thought it started with observation. I guess we don't need that.
Yes, scientists are allowed to speculate and have fun at it, but if they stop there, it's not science.
Kind of like all the solutions for the heat problem of the flood, all just speculation. For those of you who don't know, the heat problem is the problem that all models for how Noah's flood occurred produce enough heat to at minimum boil Earth's oceans away several times over. There are no plausible solutions to this so far put forward, and most young Earth creationists have simply concluded that it was a miracle, immediately removing the whole idea of their flood model from the realm of science.
So, after conception, scientists need to discipline their ideas and form hypotheses that are testable.
Which means that they don't get to have an omnipotent entity as part of them, since by definition an omnipotent entity can do anything, meaning there's no way to test it, since all possible results are compatible with such an entity. No, that doesn't mean there is no such entity, simply that science can't say anything about it if it exists.
That's essential to good science, and then the scientist has to do experiments to test the hypotheses and see if they're correct or false.
Not really, at least not in the way that most people think of experiments. where you have a test and a control and a variable that you can freely manipulate. That's awesome when you can do it, and you can in much of evolutionary biology, but like I mentioned, with astronomy, some science doesn't really offer the possibility of a direct experiment. This is also true with most of meteorology, climatology, and much of biology. Hypothesis testing in these cases is done by predicting not the outcomes of laboratory experiments, but of subsequent observations. For example, special relativity was first tested not in a laboratory, but by measuring apparent star positions during a solar eclipse to see if they would shift as a result of gravitational lensing as predicted by Einstein. This isn't an experiment in a lab, but still, Einstein made a prediction that was testable by observation, and it was tested and confirmed. Different scientific endeavors require different methodologies.
And those experiments must be reproducible by other scientists.
Or the observations must be themselves available to other scientists, or sufficiently similar subsequent observations must be.
And lastly, they get to then defend their thesis. Now, Darwin was awesome at number 1 and number 4.
Well, his ideas are falsifiable. Indeed, many of them, like blended inheritance, have been falsified. So he was good at number 2. And as I said, when you realize that 3 includes the option of subsequent observations rather than laboratory work, and that while Darwin himself didn't spend much time after his voyage on the Beagle on such observations, others did. And he was well aware of their observations and the fact that they generally lined up with his ideas of common ancestry and natural selection.
Darwin's scientific process it began with some really creative brainstorming and speculation, but instead of hypothesis formation, he had very few testable hypotheses.
The 3 main hypotheses of his that are relevant today are natural selection, sexual selection, and common ancestry. But even many of his other hypotheses, such as gemmules being the cause of inheritance, were testable and have been falsified, which is why no one talks about them. Because remember, Darwin doesn't matter to science, only to history.
We're going to talk about one. But generally, he used creative storytelling as his to build up, to formulate his ideas. And then instead of experimental research, he usually used examples from nature and then lots of, as I said, extrapolation.
Oh, so instead of experiment, he used observation, the thing that's perfectly fine in science. Got it.
So he was not following the formal scientific process.
Well, I disagree, but so what? Even if he wasn't, that doesn't mean scientists aren't now, and that's what's important. As I've already gone over, there are countless experiments in evolutionary biology.
So here's the icon number 3. Darwin was wrong about geology. And we have 2 books here, or in this one case, a book and a trilogy. And it's really interesting to know that Darwin only took 2 books with him on the voyage of the Beagle. He took with him the Bible and the book by Charles Lyell, which was newly published, called The Principles of Geology.
Which is one of the first books to push for the still current idea that most sedimentary rocks formed in the past the same way the same kind of rocks form today in depositional environments, and which was written by a lifelong and devout Christian.
And these 2 books are very diametrically opposed, as we'll see.
Lyell will be quite surprised to hear that as a Christian. See, this is one of the things, as I often say, that annoys me about young Earth creationists. They presume that people who honestly don't interpret the Bible the way they do just don't care about the Bible. This isn't true. Christians who are theistic evolutionists don't think the Bible is just useless or something. They also try to take it seriously. This isn't a fight between the good Bible-believing, God-fearing Christians and the godless heathen atheist evolutionists. This is a fight between a small minority of extremists within Christianity and basically everyone who actually cares about science and the truth.
And so he had to choose. And what we know is that within months of leaving port in England, he had rejected the Bible.
If the choice between Lyell and the Bible is so stark and binary, then why didn't even Lyell make it? Further, Sanford is just wrong about Darwin leaving his faith on the Beagle. He had always had doubts, but he didn't finally abandon his faith until the death of his daughter in 1851, whereas the 7-year voyage of the Beagle started in 1831. Weird how it took 13 years or so from the time he completely abandoned the Bible until he actually, abandoned the Bible. Although he certainly wasn't what Sanford would consider an orthodox Christian before that. But again, Sanford isn't the judge of Christianity, which is, like all religions, internally diverse in beliefs, fervor, piety, and practice. I should also point out that despite, Lyell being the guy who wrote Principles of Geology, he was a lifelong Christian, and while he helped Darwin publish about natural selection, he himself never much liked it.
Freed from the constraints of Victorian society, he had decided the Bible was just a lot of myths created by ignorant people.
I mean, it literally is mostly myths written by ignorant people. Myths are foundational stories, usually involving a god or gods that explain the origin of things, like a particular people group, the world as a whole, various parts of the world, and how all those things are to interact with each other and to the divine. That's a lot of what the Bible is, and it was written by ignorant people, because we know for a fact that people of the Iron Age, which is when the majority of the Bible was written, were ignorant of much of what we know. That's not an insult to them, it's just a fact. To pretend the Bible isn't in large part myths is to not understand what myth is as a genre. To say that it was not written by ignorant people is to simply ignore all history.
But he absorbed Charles Lyell's book on uniformitarian geology as the gospel, and we're going to see that that was his foundation. Slow and gradual geology was the basis for his theorizing about slow and gradual biological change.
Yeah, there are certainly some thematic similarities there. That's fair.
So I'd just like to recount to you one episode in his life as he was traveling through the world on the Beagle, and that was an expedition that he and the crew members took up the Santa Cruz River Valley.
So this is the Santa Cruz River in Argentina, not the one in Arizona. But Sanford takes an extremely long time to say that Darwin attributed the valley to the direct action of the Santa Cruz River, when in fact it was formed by a glacier. I'm skipping that because it made me fall asleep standing, and I don't want to subject my audience to it.
If we now turn 180 degrees to look back down from the lake, turn 180 degrees so we can look back down the valley, what we see is this picture, again from Google Earth. And what we see is that in the foreground there are landforms which are giant sand dunes that reflect a massive flood of water. This is just like the Missoula flood.
Yes, this is indeed much like the Missoula floods that caused the scablands in Washington state in the USA. And yes, Darwin was quite wrong about how exactly the valley formed, which is kind of why no one really cares what Darwin said in terms of our current understanding of science.
It's another example of, has been repeatedly demonstrated in different parts of the world, where after the end of the Ice Age, glacial lakes drained catastrophically, creating major valleys. So it's really, there's Steve Austin and other geologists have...
Ah yes, Steve Austin, the guy who tried to discredit radiometric dating by sending samples he knew couldn't be tested by the lab he was sending them to, then crowed triumphantly because they couldn't give him a reliable date, with one possible exception. That exception, even in his own work, showed xenocrysts, which is why he got back a valid date on that one sample. And of course, when all this was pointed out to him, his response amounted to, "Nuh-uh, I'm right, you're wrong, haha." Citing Stephen Austin about geology is worthless. He's an academic fraud, and he knows it.
Have shown that these evidences of a massive flood, including whole sandbars made of boulders, is the full length of the river. And it's clear this river was carved catastrophically with the breaching of a ice dam at the end of the Ice Age. So
I neither know nor care what Darwin thought about local catastrophism. Today, geologists, that is real geologists, not intentional frauds like Steve Austin, Taz Walker, and Andrew Snelling, know that some things like massive ice dam breaches, volcanoes, tsunamis, and volcanoes can rapidly deposit or erode sediment. This is taken into account, and those rocks that show evidence of such events are accepted as such. Geology is well past strict uniformitarianism and a rejection of any catastrophic events as the cause of modern rocks.
It's really ironic that this valley that he considered his inspiration for slow and gradual.
I thought his inspiration was Charles Lyell. Darwin wasn't a geologist, and Lyell was. That's why, throughout his life, Darwin relied on Lyell for things like geology. Although Darwin did make estimates for deposition times, he still did so on the basis of the work of Lyell and other geologists, not on his own theoretical work in geology, which as far as I can tell, he did none of in the first place. Should it be at all surprising that a man who was more interested in animals than in rocks failed to notice that he was in a moraine come flood valley? And further, who cares? Modern geology isn't still debating about the Santa Cruz River Valley.
And his foundation, his conceptual foundation for evolution, slow and gradual, actually was formed catastrophically by a flood.
I'm sorry, is the argument that if Darwin had been right about this one valley, he would never have thought the Earth was of great age, and so he would never have come up with gradualistic evolution by natural selection, and so we would never have known about it, and so modern science would just be sticking with, I don't know, guess it was magic, when it comes to the origin of biodiversity? That can't be the argument, right? That is the dumbest thing I've heard said by someone besides like Matt Powell, Matt Nylor, or Kent Hovind, or maybe a Flurf. Although really this argument is giving Flat Earth Roscoe's idea that the moon is made of glass dug from the Grand Canyon by giants a run for its money. Maybe that's not what Sanford is trying to say. I sure hope not.
So that's really interesting, and it really is ironic that it shows that his foundation, which was the uniformitarian geology,
which, as has already been admitted by Sanford, was not derived from his personal observations and theorizing, but on the work of Charles Lyell,
is invalid.
Okay, so because Darwin was wrong about the formation of a valley, the Earth is young and evolution is nonsense. That's the only way I can interpret this, and quite frankly, I don't think that Sanford could possibly have survived almost 2 decades as a science professor while having ideas that brain dead. I'm connected to Sanford by like 2 steps, and I would really prefer not to have the conclusion that he's just a liar. But it's becoming increasingly hard for me to come to any other conclusions. If you think you have a version of this argument that at least qualifies as an actual coherent thought, please put it in the comments, because maybe I'm just a cynical jerk who can't be charitable enough to young Earth creationists anymore.
So uniformitarian geology in the last several decades, geologists have shown over and over and over again that there are massive evidences of catastrophism in the geological record.
Yes, but not of a single aqueous catastrophe, which is what young Earth creationism needs. When you have evidence of earthquakes and volcanoes and floods interspersed with low-energy deposition, subaerial rocks, and evaporites, all of which cannot be deposited during a global flood, it means that you absolutely do not have evidence of a global catastrophe, but rather many local ones. And the best creationists have managed is to just lie about rocks, doing things like knowingly sending rocks to be dated in labs that can't do what is requested, like Steve Austin did, or just lying about cross-bending angles and where in the geological record fossils come from, like Andrew Snelling.
And so Lyell's thesis that there's never any catastrophism is dead. Lyell is discredited, and his principles of geology are only interesting as a historical relic.
Yeah, like the origin of species. That's why no one teaching a modern evolutionary biology or geology course would assign either origin of species or principles of geology as the textbook, to the surprise of no one except those who expect all knowledge to be handed down from on high unchangingly. Science has managed to move on in the last dozen and more decades, which is why if you want to talk about how you're going to overturn either modern evolutionary biology or modern geology, you really can't start by going to Lyell or Darwin. No one will care. You need to look at actual current literature and tackle that. It's the same thing as flat earthers complaining about the historical uncertainties of Eratosthenes and his experiment in which he calculated the circumference of the Earth. Who cares if Eratosthenes even existed? It doesn't matter. No one is using his well experiment today as their way of measuring the planet. And creationists, if you're insulted when I keep comparing you to flat earthers, then stop acting like them.
So uniformitarian geology is dead. His foundation is dead. But guess what? The Word of God remains alive. So he clearly chose the wrong book.
What does that even mean? That the Bible has been open to revision based on new evidence, but no one has revised it? Obviously not, because the Bible is a collection of texts. Ancient texts are what they are, no matter if they're right or wrong, or what new evidence comes to light with the sole exception of new manuscripts of the text itself. If I could prove with mathematical certainty that every interpretation of the Bible was nonsense, and that literally everything in it were completely false, that wouldn't mean that the Bible would be updated. Science, on the other hand, isn't a collection of texts, it's a technique, as we've already heard rather poorly explained. Geology isn't Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. Geology is the study of rocks that make up the Earth, how they formed, and how they got to be where they are today. Evolutionary biology isn't the origin of species. It's the study of how organisms have changed in the past and are changing now. But there are parts of both books that have survived the test of time and scientific rigor, like the Great Age of the Earth and Natural Selection. Pointing out that old science books aren't much used today and that people still believe in the Bible, which hasn't much changed, doesn't mean anything for science.
Okay, the next topic I'd like to speak about is that Darwin was wrong about the fossils. And Darwin, so I chose as an icon for that topic the coelacanth.
Of course, because we can't go more than a day without some creationist sticking his foot so far in his mouth he chokes on it while talking about the coelacanth. Let's get it over with.
And you may know that the coelacanth is a famous fossil that is known for the fact that it's been around for, within the geological column supposedly for several 100 million years.
The coelacanth is a fossil that's in the geologic column for several 100 million years. Yikes. So taken at face value, that means that a single fish was found spanning basically all of the Mesozoic, and we named that single individual colossal fish the coelacanth. So since that's almost incomprehensibly dumb, and even if I'm being more charitable than I have any need to be, poorly communicated, let's talk about what the coelacanth is. Coelacanths are now represented by a single deep-sea genus, Latimeria, but during the Mesozoic also existed in a variety of shallow marine and freshwater forms, all of which are distinct enough from modern Latimeria to warrant different generic designations. Among sarcopterygians, that is the lobe-finned fish and tetrapods, coelacanths are more closely related to tetrapods than some, being crossopterygian, meaning that their paired fins are similar to tetrapod limbs in some way, but they're farther than others. They're farther from tetrapods than lungfish are, which together make up Rhipidistia, with the lungfish in Dipnomorpha and the tetrapods in Tetrapodomorpha, with non-tetrapod forms like Pandrichthyes. Their fossil record has never included deep-sea examples, for the simple reason that deep-sea fossils are hard to come by at all, and so our fossil record for such environments is extremely sparse. But their shallow water fossil record stretches to the end of the Cretaceous, when, like many things living near the surface, they went extinct. Turns out that living at the bottom of the ocean leaves you pretty well safe from an asteroid impact on the other side of the planet. And so despite not having a presence in the fossil-bearing strata of the Cenozoic, one genus of coelacanth survived.
But then mysteriously disappeared about 65 million years ago, according to the interpretation of the fossil record.
It's not that mysterious. A giant space rock slammed into the planet.
And furthermore, this fish has very large fins, and
not really. The distinctiveness of the fins of the lobe-finned fish is in their internal anatomy of the fins, not their size. That's why they're called lobe-finned and not big-finned. The interesting thing about them is the complex internal structure of bones and muscle.
And so it was believed to be a transitional form. These large fins, it was thought to be living in shallow water.
We know for a fact that many coelacanths lived in coastal waters, but far from being a great transition to tetrapods, coelacanths are among the most basally branching lobe-finned fish, and so members of this clade can only really resemble the most basal forms from which tetrapods would later diverge. But even then, they are also derived, which obscures some of these clues about the primitive skeleton and musculature common to lobe-finned fish, yourself included.
And that it would crawl, kind of creep along the bottom with its fins, and eventually might creep up on land and become the transitional form to amphibians.
Wrong. Coelacanths are quite unsuited to terrestrial locomotion, and there is no idea that they were ancestral to tetrapods. There are many much closer organisms that in fact do show transitional forms. These are animals like Eusthenopteron, Pandrichthyes, Elgenerpeton, Acanthostega, Ichthyostega, Crassigyrinus, and Loxoma. I'll note that all of these form a wonderful transitional lineage from fully aquatic fish like Eusthenopteron all the way to the earliest tetrapods, and all without ever mentioning a coelacanth, since they're not on the line to tetrapods.
So the interesting thing about this fish is that we now know that the coelacanth is still alive today. And it's been found to be alive today. It's an example of a living fossil. It didn't go extinct 65 million years ago. Since it didn't go extinct, the 65 million years becomes highly questionable, doesn't it? Since it doesn't mark something that didn't happen.
What is he talking about? The coelacanth isn't a single species, it's a whole order. It's like saying, gee, all the rodents went extinct except for this one genus of mouse. I guess nothing happened. That's so beyond reasonable, I am forced to conclude that Sanford is just lying to his audience. Every single genus but one of the entire order went extinct, with all the non-avian dinosaurs, most of the crocodilians, all the sauropterygians, every pterosaur, most sea turtles, all the mosasaurs, etc. The fact that something survived is not at all something that brings into question whether anything at all even happened. The only thing special about coelacanths, compared to the other groups that survived, like small mammals, birds, frogs, etc., is that they didn't leave much behind in terms of a fossil record since then, which again, given the habitat of the sole extant genus of coelacanth, isn't really surprising.
And the interesting thing about coelacanth is it's not found in shallow water, it's found in deep water.
Unlike fossil coelacanths, and where we don't normally get many fossils anyway.
And it doesn't creep along the bottom, it swims like any other fish.
Yeah, because coelacanths, both before the end Cretaceous and now, are not on a line leading to terrestrial animals. They represent a lineage that stayed well adapted to life exclusively in the water. Hey, this video has already been going for a while, so we're going to call it here. We'll continue next time with more talk about the fossil record. If you liked this video, please hit like and leave a comment telling me what you liked, and if you didn't like it, hit dislike and tell me why not in the comments. Either way, I hope you subscribe and use the notification bell to turn on all notifications so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching, but before you go, I just want to say a special thank you to my channel members and my patrons, especially those pledging $20 or above. Bob Knob, Work in Progress, Vantovent, Tapioca Weasel, Denny5252, Ian Chen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, McSpooks, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Elleran Teller, and Pat L. Dennis. As you probably know, YouTube is a very volatile platform, and from month to month my income on the channel can swing wildly. But the people you see on screen are directly supporting so that I don't have to worry too much about that, and the channel can keep going as it is, and perhaps even improving. If you'd like to join this team, there are links below to join the channel or in the description to join the Patreon. The Patreon starts as low as $1 a month, and the channel memberships start as low as $1.99 a month. On Patreon, you can even get a discount for pledging annually. If you do decide to pledge, you'll get access to an exclusive Discord server just for channel supporters, as well as early access to all of my pre-recorded videos, often up to 2 months in advance. Higher tiers will unlock even better perks. Now, if the annual or monthly pledge isn't right for you, but you still want to support the channel, there is a merch store down in the description, as well as an Amazon wishlist, just for me. And if financial support isn't something you can or want to do, then if you still want to help out the channel, please just like and share these videos and make sure you comment on them. It really helps the channel out. Thanks again for watching.